Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoy this video. For more content, please support us by subscribing.
I recently read an editorial from 1842. The title of that editorial was Knowledge is Power. When I read it, I thought, ooh, who's the most powerful man alive? And of course, the answer is MacGyver. Now, I know there's the newer MacGyver, but this is the older MacGyver, the one I grew up with. He could make anything out of whatever was in the kitchen sink and in his pocket. I was always amazed with that. In the editorial, it went on to say, not just knowledge is power, but the happiness of any community goes hand in hand with the knowledge possessed by the people. Maybe that's why MacGyver was always so happy. Well, he wasn't always happy, but the picture says he is, so we'll go with it. I have found that knowledge brings happiness, resiliency, confidence, better abilities in problem solving, and a desire really for more knowledge. When the more you know, the more increased ability you have to act. On the opposite side of that, ignorance brings really a fear of change, relationship crises. It may bring economic downfalls. It'll show your weaknesses. It brings a staleness about you and your character. For Isaiah, ignorance brings captivity. In verse 13 of 2 Nephi chapter 15, it says, "Therefore my people are gone into captivity because they have no knowledge." That seems to be a little bit of a theme for the entire chapter, the idea of ignorance versus knowledge. For some of the things he teaches, there are things that bring knowledge, and there are some things he teaches in this chapter that really bring ignorance or result in ignorance. One of the first things he teaches in verse 8 are people who really join house to house till there's no place for anybody else because they just want it all themselves. They are greedy. And greed is a poison. We make poor and irrational decisions if our decisions are motivated by greediness. Greed for monetary gain. Greed that results in a conflict of interest. Desire for power, titles, and recognition of men. Really, the poison of greed leaves many houses desolate. Isaiah gives two physical examples. The first is he talks about an acre or a vineyard that has 10 acres normally would produce about 3,200 gallons of wine per year. I had to look that one up. But it ends up producing a simple bath or 9 gallons. He also, second example, there's a seed of a homer. 6.5 bushels of seed yields 0.65 bushel or an ephah. 1/10 of a yield of what you'd expect at the maximum. He is really teaching, even the land is going to teach, when you're greedy, it will not produce as well as when the righteous have it. Greed leads to an unproductive life. A passion for pleasure, he writes, really promotes ignorance. He talks about those that rise up early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink. They continue until night and wine and flame them. And the harp with the viol, they're just having lots of music with their party. But they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands. When the passion of pleasure has become the upmost in a person's life, their passion for God and his truth and his ways are always squeezed out. Isaiah seems to teach that a focus on a passion for pleasure displaces knowledge. It prevents you from having a meaningful relationship with God because you're too consumed on the pleasure for passion. It will never satisfy your spiritual hunger or your spiritual thirst. It decreases your motivation to learn from spiritual problems and make lasting changes. And Isaiah's example, a focus on passion for pleasure, brings us into hell's mouth. In verse 18, another thing that Isaiah teaches about knowledge and ignorance, he says that the cords of vanity seem to choke knowledge. His example is woe or misery to those that draw iniquity with cords of vanity and sin as if it were a cart rope. It's a little bit of an analogy that you're tied to a cart like an animal would be, and you're hauling garbage through the muck, and you're not bright enough to get rid of yourself, get rid of the garbage or the sin that is with you. And you're just going through the motions with the sin and not looking up, realizing there's a way to escape through Christ. The cords of vanity always choke out knowledge of God. The truest character of ignorance are vanity and pride and arrogance. The fourth thing is, in verse 19, Isaiah teaches, in here that these people say, let God make speed. Let him hustle. Hasten his work, that we may see it. Really, they're saying, we want to see it to believe it. Seeking signs blinds us to new knowledge. They are saying that if God will hustle, get his job done, that is a prerequisite to them believing. Sign seeking blinds us to God's knowledge. Deception always keeps us in ignorance's prison. In verse 20 it says, woe to them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Deception blinds us to the light that illuminates our understandings and obfuscates the truth from our minds. With absolute truth, deception, especially self-deception, along with uncontrolled passion, results in the rationalization and justification of almost any act. When we deceive ourselves, we rationalize, we justify our actions. We pretend that what we're doing is okay with us. And I love the words of Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. There's another group that Isaiah talks about that chokes out knowledge and keeps us in ignorance. If you're a wannabe intellectual, these are the ones that are, he says, woe, misery, unto the wise in their own eyes, prudent in their own sight. For decades, President David O. McKay said, it has been popular in America for the cynical intellectuals to sneer and scoff at what they do not understand or want to understand. Isaiah also teaches that justification of any kind entrenches our ignorance. Verses 22 and 23, he says, woe to the mighty who drink wine, men of strength to mingle strong drink. By the way, I think of some of the commercials when I think of this. Everybody's looking good. Everybody's just pretty strong. And they're mingling the strong drink. But what you see is not reality. They justify the wicked for reward. He who will not admit his mistakes will soon justify his ignorance. But Isaiah does make several promises to help us in our day. And for me, it's a little bit of an analogy. I read a book, one of my favorite books, by David McCullough. Actually, I've read several by him. He's just a great author. About the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. One of the things I learned in his book is the Brooklyn Bridge has 4 main cables. Each main cable is 15 3/4 of an inch in diameter and has 5,434 steel wires. There's over 14,000 miles of cable in the Brooklyn Bridge. But going back to those strands, each strand has its job to help hold up the bridge, to support it. A lot of things that Isaiah teaches are like strands that hold up the bridge between us and God. Their function is to help us, connect us, and secure us to God. Because God's daily strands that he gives to us connect us to knowledge of him. The first example of how God's going to do this that Isaiah teaches is in the last days he will establish an ensign. In verses 25 and 26, as he speaks of an ensign, it's a standard. Anciently in Isaiah's time, it was a banner or flag, a rallying point which an army would gather. And Isaiah says this banner is going to, or this ensign is going to hiss forth. Yeah, it's kind of whistle a call. Hey, when you see this, you got to gather. And I think of in 1847, when a small group of individuals stood on a peak overlooking the Salt Lake Valley. And the way President Gordon B. Hinckley described it, when the brethren stood on the summit, they looked over this valley to the south of them. It was largely barren, except for the willows and rushes that grew along the streams that carried water into the mountains to the lake. There was no building of any kind, but Brigham Young had said the previous Sunday, "This is the place." The summit where they stood was named Ensign Peak out of reference to these great prophetic words of Isaiah. And he, speaking of God, will lift up an ensign to the nations from far, and will hiss unto them from the ends of the earth, and behold, they shall come with speed, swiftly. This church, the Church of Jesus Christ, is a standard which Isaiah said the Lord would set up for the people in the latter day. Another thing that Isaiah talks about that I think is also keeps us that connection and goes along with the church is at the first he talked about a vineyard, the first 7 verses. That vineyard in the first 7 verses has a wall put around it. The rocks in the vineyard are removed. There's a watchtower set up, watchmen on the tower. And it's a great analogy to the church as well. There's a warning. If you're in a leadership and you're a man or a woman, you have a responsibility, don't neglect it, because that's what happened in ancient Israel. But part of what the church does is it helps us, as a part of God's vineyard, to make sure the rocks get taken out as we every week meet together, and fortifies us and strengthens us. So, God establishes an ensign in the latter days, or his church, that's going to help connect us with him. He also speaks of feeding his lambs in verse 17. That analogy goes far with Christ, as he talks about us being his sheep. That daily feeding process is what God does with us with his Spirit. The verse before it, he talks about, the context is that, well, I'll better read the whole thing. But the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment, and God that is holy shall be sanctified in righteousness. Sanctification is the process of becoming free from sin, pure, clean, and holy through the atonement of Jesus Christ. It really is through Christ that we're connected with our Heavenly Father. And there's the promise, no matter what is going on in our life, no matter how far we've gone astray, we can know that the hand of the Lord is stretched out to, still, for us. He wants to reach us wherever we are. I have found in my life that knowledge is power, and it leads to happiness. So I conclude with the words from Bobby McFerrin, from a song that I have sung many times, and you probably may know too. In his words, he sang, "Don't worry, be happy." Thanks for joining me. Hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.